Recently, new research has revealed that the Germans may have been researching flying craft and possibly anti-gravity for over 150 years.
I was aware of the 1890s airship mystery as a result of being interested in UFOs since I was a kid. And when you follow through on looking at the 1890s airship mystery, you're going to come across the Sonora Aero Club.
This is one of these things that's really never adequately been explained to this day. So starting in Sacramento, California in 1896, going through various parts of the American West, to as far as Chicago and I think St. Louis and some of the Midwest there.
The evidence that we have for the 1890s airship mystery and these airship sightings actually happening are the numerous newspaper reports all over the western United States, the dozens in some cases, the hundreds in other cases of people in major cities and other various populated areas seeing these airships. Not only seeing these airships flying overhead, but the airships would land and the crew and the pilots would step off these things and tell the people about the airships. They'd bring them on board and they'd show them.
Airship technology in 1897, this is something a lot of people don't realize, was so primitive. All right, so airships, first of all, hardly existed in the United States at all. They were most advanced in France and in Europe. And even there, they couldn't go more than 5 or 10 miles. And they were impossible to navigate. They were dangerous as hell. People regularly got killed trying to fly them. So to have an airship that's even being described as going 30 to 50 miles per hour, that's really an impossibility as far as the technology. To steer it and to have it go the distances that this airship would have gone, I think is impossible.
Some of them would land, they'd interact with the occupants. This is before Zeppelins and dirigibles, so they really didn't know what they were.
So it's the newspaper reports that must be looked at more closely and taken more seriously because there's so many of them and they give so much more information than people usually get. We learn about the Sonora Aero Club and we first hear of this mysterious NIMSA from a man named Charles A.A. Delschau, who was a German immigrant born in Brandenburg, Prussia in, I think, 1830. And he comes to America as a young man via Texas and continues on out to California at the behest of this mysterious NIMSA group. He then, after being there for 3 or 4 years and being involved with the activities of this flying club, he then returns to Texas where he spends the rest of his life. And finally in the 1890s, he took his diary and he was a very good artist, and he created several hundreds of paintings of these arrows. And there are several albums of them. And he left them behind when he died, and they were almost destroyed. They were found in a trash heap in an antique store. According to Delschau, NIMSA was a secretive German-based group that was financing and providing resources to these various small groups of inventors building flying machines. And this was all done very secretively.
The Sonora Aero Club functioned under NIMSA for a period of time and then broke away. You have a bunch of people that are developing high technology in secret.
These arrows, as they called their flying machines, appear to have been powered by a very rudimentary proof of concept version of anti-gravity technology.
In that time, in that space, you see the development. You kind of see technical development. You see the beginnings of some sort of a secret group that's developing high technology.
I'm convinced that the 1890s airships were definitely the same technology the 1850s further developed.
It's that idea that we have secret societies creating high technology and very mysterious about where their high technology is coming from.
But are there other researchers who were interested in the same ideas that the Germans were researching? Was anyone else interested in anti-gravity? We discovered 2 men in the United States who were interested in the connection between gravity and electricity, which, when properly understood, produces an anti-gravity effect. The 2 men were Serbia immigrant Nikolai Tesla and the other was an American whose name was Thomas Townsend Brown. While much is known about Tesla, very little is known about T. Townsend Brown. Tesla came to the United States and began working with Thomas Edison. They had a disagreement about direct current, which Edison favored, and alternating current, which Tesla favored, and which has become the standard today. Tesla's experiments with electricity are very well known. It is likely that both Tesla and T. Townsend Brown worked together on the famous Philadelphia experiment, in which it was discovered that large amounts of electricity could cause a ship to disappear and possibly relocate. We know so much more about Tesla than we do about T. Townsend Brown. Why? Who was he? And what did he do?
I was attending a group we had in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, called the Flatlanders. They were sort of rebels, scientific rebels, and that's where I learned about Townsend Brown. And one fellow took me and we Xeroxed his whole file on Townsend Brown's work. I thought, my God, this is true. You know, there is this correlation between charge and gravity here. Brown was researching this way back as early as the beginning of the 20th century.
There does appear to be a direct relationship between electrical charge and gravity, and the reason for this goes back to the Biefeld-Brown effect, which was originated from the results of Dr. Thomas Townsend Brown and then Professor Biefeld, who then applied scientifically what Brown had discovered.
He would charge a capacitor to 100,000 volts, and it would be suspended from the ceiling and find it would move towards the positively charged side. He calls this electrogravitics.
Brown's basic discovery is actually quite simple. If you take a piece of electrical material and you charge it up to a really high level, you will start to get thrust, gravitational thrust that comes off of that highly charged metal. So if, for example, you have a disk that has a negative plate on the bottom and a positive anode on the top, sure enough, you're going to get thrust that points in an upwards direction.
If you can create what's called unbalanced forces on the capacitor so that the charge on one side of the capacitor pushes on the capacitor one way a different amount than the other charges push the other way, the capacitor is going to move. And Brown found that this happens in asymmetrical capacitors where one plate is small and the other is very large. So he had these things that look like flying saucer-like umbrellas for one plate, and the other would be a ball, and the whole thing would lift. He was able to get this to lift its own weight plus 10% extra weight, quite amazingly.
And this ties in perfectly with what Nassim Haramein has discovered in his physics papers that won a Belgian Physics Prize, which is that if you look at the physics of the black hole and you look at the physics around the atom and the nucleus, it's the same thing.
Now this is just a small part of Brown's research we're talking about. He also got into electrokinetics.
The gravitational flow into the black hole has equivalence in the basic freshman year science equations with the physics of the atom. So the flux of charge is a gravitational flux. The two are intertwined, and that actually is great for us because it simplifies a lot of the hard work in physics.
In fact, during the war, what was he doing? You know, they say radar work. It was at the time of the Philadelphia experiment. There's a lot of rumors that he was on this, and he has never denied it when people would ask him. He would not say, but he would not deny.
There's only one field, and we've been lied to in thinking that gravity is one thing and electromagnetic energy is something else.
Brown was highly respected. He worked in the Naval Research Laboratory. He had very strong connections with the military. He made demonstrations of some discs to the Navy out at Pearl Harbor that reportedly were flying at hundreds of miles per hour.
So what happens is the classified world takes these, classifies those technologies, and essentially runs away with them, preventing the rest of the world, literally preventing the rest of the world through legal means from developing into those types of technologies. So we're talking forms of electrogravitics, electromagnetic propulsion technologies, gravitational propulsion technologies.
It's only when you start working in very, very high amperage conditions, like what Nikola Tesla was working in, like what Dr. Thomas Townsend Brown was working in, like what the Germans were working in with their Bell technology, that you now have gravitational vectors coming off of that actual electrostatic charge. And what's so fascinating about this is the timing, because T. Townsend Brown was doing this research back in the 1920s. And that research was then co-opted by the Germans and other groups and allowed them to develop these working technologies.
Now we can see and understand how electricity and gravity can form a field that can be manipulated. Objects can be moved around, even in a vacuum. When we ask the question, are there any other researchers looking into this connection, we discover the work of Nikolai Kozyrev.
Torsion is a term in physics for the rotation and twisting of the lattice structure of space-time. That's it in a nutshell.
There is a branch of science in Russian astrophysics that was largely pioneered by Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev. He was one of the main scientists to talk about this, and it's called torsion fields.
Kozyrev noticed that if the standard model of the sun or any other star as being a big, huge, chained up hydrogen bomb, perpetually exploding and then collapsing in on itself again, that if that model were true, then the sun should be spitting out much more neutrino radiation.
Torsion fields are a very unique and bizarre science because it's a science of something that is an unseen force that is unacknowledged by conventional Western thinking. If you go back to the time of Isaac Newton, gravity was working just fine before the apple fell on his head. It's just that we didn't acknowledge that it was there. In much the same way, torsion fields are a basic part of the physics of the universe. Kozyrev demonstrated this conclusively.
Kozyrev began to think, well, this means that the sun, and this is why I personally think nuclear bombs, particularly hydrogen bombs, are accessing some other form of energy. Because this is what Kozyrev came to, and what he came to was, well, the sun is, because of certain features of this differential rotation of the plasma under electromagnetic stress, what you have here is an open system, and the sun is literally coupled to the other elements of that system, namely the planets in their orbits, their angular momenta, inertial mass, and so on and so forth, that all feed into this open system, and it's gating energy.
Kozyrev found different ways to measure these forces, and for me what was always interesting was whether he had something that was like a pendulum where there's 10 grams of weight on one side, 1 gram on the other side, it's on a string, and the pendulum would then swing in the direction of the torsion field just by vibrating the top of the string. That was the key. The vibrations somehow made it very sensitive to these torsion fields.
That energy is going to vary over time depending upon the geometrical configuration of local space.
He found that mechanical processes would generate torsion fields.
Kozyrev begins to investigate this, and he concludes that this energy is coming from time.
But then one day he's reading Goethe's book on the temptation of Faust by the devil Mephistopheles, and he has this sudden emotional reaction, and then the needle points towards him. And that showed that his consciousness could create a torsion field in the same way that these mechanical processes could.
He begins to investigate this, and something interesting happens because he's roundly denounced in Pravda for being a quack, a mountebank, a fraud. And he sort of disappears. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, lo and behold, we discover that what Kozyrev was actually doing was extremely top secret work for the Soviet Union in torsion physics. If you really dig in the record, all the indicators are there. The Nazis are working in torsion physics. The Russians are working in torsion physics. The Russians are detonating their H-bombs, and when they do, they're getting, probably runaway yields from their calculations. And oh, there's this astrophysicist over here that's been talking about the sun, and it's not performing, properly according to the predictions of general relativity. Well, we'll shuffle him off the stage and put him to work on figuring out just what the heck's going on here, because we can't have our bombs blowing up the world. We only want to blow up the Americans. The Pravda article denouncing him was, I think, probably for the purpose of creating a convenient cover, to shuffle him off into some Soviet black project. At the beginning of the thermonuclear era, they began to realize that they were dealing not just with thermonuclear physics, they were dealing with a much deeper physics, and that they had to explore this.
What is going on inside an atom? You have a positively charged nucleus, and you have negatively charged electron clouds. The idea that there's a particle called an electron in there is completely dubious, but we know the clouds exist. That means that as the electron clouds are in flux around the positively charged nucleus, you're also dealing with the flow of current. And the flow of current, as we saw with Brown's research, is a gravitational flow. Therefore, the flow of gravity and the flow of electricity run together. Therefore, the actual atom itself is made by a gravitational flow. The two are fundamentally intertwined. That's why an electrical current creates a gravitational current. Let's now surmise that gravity is the energy that is flowing into the Earth to create the Earth moment by moment. That would make us like mosquitoes that are being blown into a screen window, and the current is pushing down on us. So we're calling it a pull of gravity. It's wrong. It's the push of gravity pushing us down. And it blows through us because it's also flowing into us, but at a much smaller rate. So then what happens is you have various means by which you can get spin in this fluid-like energy that's making the Earth. So a spin in gravity is called a torsion field. The torsion field is actually the equivalent of a wave that moves through the gravitational field as an impulse. It is a spin.
Really intrigues me about all this is it's precisely in the middle 1950s, as all of this is going on, as Nick Cook points out, that anti-gravity talk in the open literature, be it popular or scientific, just dies.
This is exactly true. In the early to mid 1950s, there was a brief flurry within the United States public media of talk about anti-gravity and how we were very close to achieving breakthroughs in this essentially flying saucer technology. And all of this was being discussed, and then it did stop abruptly. In 1955, end of 1955 is when it ended.
A lot of different scientists who claim to have developed these anti-gravity technologies find that there are strange effects on people's consciousness when they're near them, that they'll feel like they're in some sort of exotic state of consciousness, almost like a psychedelic drug has been given to them. There is a very strange interrelationship between the technologies and the consciousness.
And we know the stories of Morgan and Tesla and Morgan suppressing Tesla. Well, I don't think it's because Morgan was an inherently bad guy alone. He was an inherently bad guy. But on the other hand, he's probably got advisors telling him, well, if this guy lets this technology out, it could be turned into a really bad weapon that basically anybody could build.
There are obvious reasons for why the Russian government and the US government and any other world governments would want to suppress the knowledge of torsion field technology. First of all, let's be absolutely clear. This technology is not entirely benevolent. There are extraordinarily damaging and destructive things that can be done with it.
And on the other hand, it would be the end of our power. How do we transition to this next thing without losing control and having everything go to heck in a handbasket and blow ourselves up in the process?
And so the torsion field is actually the ultimate key to the unified model of all science, where we can now link consciousness, technology, and physics together as all part of one greater totality.
The elites within the United States military have known about these forces since the 1920s. What the Germans were working on during the same time period remained a secret until long after the war ended. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and documents began leaking out of the former communist countries. Many of these documents had never been seen before. In 1995, a large group of documents were discovered in Poland, which tell a very interesting story about a fascinating object called the bell.
The bell is an interesting story that has come out. It's one of those stories, incidentally, that's come out since the German Wiedervereinigung, the German reunification. It's a story that, in my opinion, lies at the very center of the Nazi UFO myth, this idea that the Nazis had field propulsion flying saucers, and they took secret trips to the moon and Mars and what have you.
The bell's a propulsion system. It's basically a kind of reactor, and that reactor is the power source for a thing called the Haunebu.
This SS Obergruppenführer, his name was Jakob Sporenberg, and he was tried by a Polish war crimes court after the war for the crime of having murdered 60 Germans that were part of this project in order to keep it secret. And in his affidavit before the Polish War Crimes Court, he describes details of this project called Die Glocke, the bell. He describes a device that's bell-shaped. It's about 12 to 15 feet high, if I remember, and it's about 12, maybe 12 feet wide. It's bell-shaped. It's described in terms that make you think it's either a ceramic cover or a ceramic metal. It's cryogenically cooled, either with liquid helium or liquid oxygen, something that's going to super cool it. And on the inside of this device, there are two rotating cylinders. Sporenberg describes that they poured into these counter-rotating cylinders a substance called serum 525, which was described in the affidavit supposedly as a very heavy, dense, viscous, gooey metal that was a deep maroon or cherry red color. There were enough details that you could sit down and kind of reverse engineer the thinking, the physics thinking that the Germans may have been employing in this device.
We also have heard from a variety of insiders and from the papers and the data that came out that the Germans also had developed an interesting system based on the so-called red mercury, in which the rotation of mercury in a highly charged electrostatic tube leads to an anti-gravitational field as well.
So this serum 525 is put into these counter-rotating cylinders, and they're spun up, to high speed in opposite directions. And what this is going to do, just to explain a bit of the physics for a moment, it's going to cohere the rotation of the atoms and molecules of this substance on one plane. Okay, so in other words, it's going to align the axis of rotation of these things. Sporenberg also describes that it makes a buzzing sound or a hissing sound. So the Germans actually nicknamed this device Der Bienenstock, the beehive, because it's buzzing, it's making this buzz.
When I was studying Delschau's artwork, I saw something that was stunning. This had to do with the propulsion system, the energy system for one of these arrows from the 1850s. And what it was something that Delschau identifies as a generator cone, okay? And it rotates, spins on a central axis that it's fixed to. And this mystery fuel, liquid fuel, is injected into the process. Well, the shape of this thing is the shape of a common shape of a bell. My jaw dropped because you're talking about Germans, you're talking about a spinning bell-shaped object with a secretive liquid fuel serum. Here was this same exact basic concept in the 1850s, that Delchaume clearly in the 1890s included in one of his drawings.
We have indications that the Germans are experimenting with some substance that is being zapped with lots of electricity. And right there, that tells me plasma. The substance is heavy, it's liquid, and it's red. So that tells me it's probably metallic. It's probably an oxide of mercury and, something else in chemical compound. So what they're creating, in effect, is a version of the sun. Because the sun's a plasma, it's under electromagnetic stress, you've got the differential rotation of the plasma, and that's going to create what physicists call torsion. I think that the Bell device is a device designed by mimicking the sun to create a maximum torsion shear effect. And as a result, it's going to create a kind of magnetic bubble or cancellation of the gravitational field. And in fact, this is what is reported of the Bell, because the concentration camp victims who apparently saw this being tested at night on the surface saw something that looked like a barrel glowing a pale blue, rising, kind of levitating and then falling back down below the tree line.
The Haunebu is your classic UFO. Looks like a UFO that you've seen in 1,000 magazines. So they developed the Haunebu around the Bell, and they had to shield the Haunebu because the Bell gives off so much radiation and heat and a lot of other things.
At the end of the war, the Nazis executed the scientists and technicians, the middle echelon scientists and technicians involved with the project, to keep it from falling into the hands of the Russians and the Allies. I think aspects of this project ended up in Argentina and were experimented upon under independent Nazi control even after the war, which is very logical, because if you've got that kind of technology, the atom bomb is kind of a, it's kind of a Model T technology. You can give that to the Americans, But this we're going to keep for ourselves, and we're going to work on this some more, and I think that's exactly what they did. All of this adds up to me that they are experimenting with a prototypical kind of proof of concept torsion technology, field propulsion technology.
So these technologies were combined together to develop an actual working flying saucer significantly in advance of when we normally would think of anyone in our Earth governments coming into contact with this, i.e. the Roswell crash. The Germans had about a 10-year head start on that.
Before his death in 1995, Ben Rich, the father of the stealth bomber and head of Lockheed Martin's top-secret Skunk Works research facilities, said this to a group of people after a speech.
We already have the means to travel amongst the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do.